But I'm also going to talk a little bit about the history and to point out that these concurrent histories come from quite a different space to what we are used to today, and that those changes have happened in a relatively short period of time. To point out that it really was only about 200 years ago that children were considered the property of their parents, and that impacted quite significantly on all their relationships, but also on whether or not those responsible for government had any interest at all in children. For a long time there was no interest because it was assumed that parents took responsibility for the children. During the late 19th century we did see the emergence of what's called today the child rescue movement. It still wasn't necessarily what we know as child protection, because it was really based on those children that were visibly not being cared for by their parents, either for reasons of abandonment or because they were illegitimate, which was at that stage a barrier to effective parenting as well. Towards the end of the 19th century, this movement then also started to look at broader areas of need for children in terms of protection, and particularly in the US and the United Kingdom we saw for the first time the emergence of child protection agencies. And they were at that stage entirely non-government agencies. There were laws and soon after courts that came to be involved in that process, but still the reforms and changes were driven very much from the NGO sector. But interestingly, a debate that's still here with us today emerged at that time as well. And that's the debate about whether or not the best place for a child is to be in an institution or it is to be in some form of substitute family care in the circumstances that the children cannot be with their families. So that theme has continued to this day. So there was a consolidation, I suppose, of child protection law during the first half of the 20th century. And then in the 1960s, it became a more professional space. And we started to see more academic research, the professionalisation of child protection practice, and quite crucially, the media started to play a significant role in child protection practice, starting to put a spotlight on practice. That continues to be a force, sometimes for good, sometimes not for good, in terms of the development of good practice in the child protection space. But the further development that took place in the last years of the last century were around an attempt by legislative reformers to broaden the scope of child protection practice, both in terms of the areas that were examined, but also in extending responsibility for reporting by the introduction of mandatory reporting. And alongside that, there was also a significant increase in the amount of centralised control that government played. So now we're in the space where government is seen to be the number one responsible agency for child protection. And for those of you who work for the government, those responsibilities are very much seen in the public eye to fall to you. I do make the observation that I think in that process, which has happened once again relatively recently, that there has been a degree of the loss of community role in that space. And one of the reflections that is emerging out of child rights conversations at the moment is how to re-engage communities in child protection practice. So that's a kind of broad overview of the child protection developments in the last 200 years. Alongside that, we've had the child rights movement develop, largely in the same period of time and influenced by the same conditions. Very much the child rescue movement and the child rights movement emerged out of the late 19th century because of a concern for the social conditions that many children were living in. And that developed a lot, once again, driven by NGOs, in particular, out of the UK, Save the Children and Eglantine Jebb, who were forceful advocates at that time for the articulation of child rights. And so the 20th century story for child rights has been around articulating in international frameworks what international child rights looks like. And they're some of the key events that took place. Fairly slowly, but significantly aligning with what has continued to be an international movement and aligning with the international human rights conversation. And that has meant that there are some key characteristics to the framework that I wanted to particularly highlight. One is that the framework purports to be universal. Its aims is that it should cover all children in all settings. But it also recognises that there are multiple rights bearers in the life of duty holders. That children as rights bearers need to be supported by a range of duty bearers, community, government and family. And that these responsibilities are interdependent. So you can see that idea that while government plays a crucial role in child protection, the responsibility is broader than just what government should do. But one of the other key features of the child rights framework is that it seeks to be transparent and it seeks to hold particularly governments, but also all of us as members of the community accountable to the progress we make in implementing the rights of children. In Australia, we've kind of played catch-up. There have been moments where we've played key roles. Australia played a key role in the drafting of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. But at other times, we have, for a number of reasons, political, geographic, we've been a bit isolated from the international conversations. So Australia ratified the convention in 1990, relatively early on, within the first year of the convention's existence. But notably, there was no taking on of responsibility at a government level, and even the responsibility that was given to the Human Rights Commission was one that had no resources attached to it whatsoever. This is a kind of breakdown of some of the detail of the convention. I'm not going to dwell on that other than to point out a couple of the key provisions of the convention which are particularly pertinent to child rights, to child protection practice. Under survival rights up the top, under family, you'll see that there are about, 8 or 9 clauses of the convention which relate to the role of the family and the responsibilities of the state to support the role of the family, which kind of goes back to that issue that was being used to challenge the efficacy of the convention by right-wing religious groups, that it was undermining the right to the family, the rights of the family. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the convention upholds very strongly the centrality of the family in the proper and appropriate upbringing of a child. We also see in development rights culture, which is something I want to come back to in a little while, but also under the rights to participation, Article 12, the right to participate in decisions. Now, a lot of these are universal rights and universal human rights. So they are child rights that are also rights that are held by all humans. The Convention also recognises that children have particular vulnerabilities, changing vulnerabilities as they go through the various stages of development. But that those vulnerabilities mean that there are special protections that are required. And your work forms part of that special protection that is set out under the Convention and involves consideration of protection from violence, protection from abuse and neglect. So the framework intends to be international. It intends to support best practice. It identifies that we're all stakeholders and duty bearers in protecting children, and it calls upon us in our practice to reflect and to monitor good and bad practice and to share those observations. From that framework, we see the emergence of practice that is now called child rights-based, a child rights-based approach. And here are some of the ideas that are involved in a child rights-based approach. The one that I find the most challenging, but also the most exciting, is finding ways that we can see the world around us through the eyes of a child.